From a Stoic perspective, shielding the mind from negative thoughts does not mean eliminating them, but removing their power to affect us emotionally. The Stoic understands that the human mind, by nature, produces continuous impressions, many of them uncomfortable or disturbing. Trying to completely silence these thoughts would be not only impossible, but also contrary to Stoic logic itself, which acknowledges the existence of emotions and impulses as part of the human condition. The central principle lies in understanding that thoughts do not arise in a neutral way. They are interpretations we make of facts, shaped by beliefs, expectations, fears, and desires. The same event can generate calm in one person and anguish in another, which demonstrates that suffering does not lie in the event itself, but in the meaning we assign to it. For the Stoic, this distinction is fundamental. The fact is external, objective, and often unavoidable. The interpretation is internal, subjective, and open to correction. In this sense, the true mental work does not consist in trying to control the external world, circumstances, or the behavior of others, tasks that lie beyond our domain, but in governing one's own judgments. Governing judgments means critically examining each thought before accepting it as true. When a negative thought arises, the Stoic asks whether it is rational, whether it corresponds to the facts, or whether it is merely an impulsive reaction based on fear or habit. By exercising this rational control, the individual ceases to be a prisoner of initial impressions. The thought may still arise, but it does not automatically turn into suffering. This practice creates a kind of mental shield. Events continue to happen, thoughts continue to appear, but the trained mind is not carried away by them. Instead of reacting emotionally, the Stoic responds consciously and deliberately. Moreover, Stoicism teaches that inner freedom is directly linked to this capacity for judgment. When judgments are poorly governed, a person becomes vulnerable to any external stimulus, living in constant emotional fluctuation. When judgments are disciplined by reason, the mind achieves stability because it comes to rely on internal criteria rather than circumstances. Therefore, shielding the mind, from a Stoic standpoint, is a process of educating thought. It involves learning to recognize that not every thought deserves credibility and that not every impression demands an emotional reaction. With practice and consistency, the individual develops a firmer, calmer, and more rational mental posture, capable of facing adversity without being dominated by it. For the Stoics, psychological suffering arises at the moment when an individual confuses facts with opinions. A fact is neutral, impersonal, and independent of our will. Something happened, someone said something, a circumstance imposed itself. By itself, the fact carries no suffering, pain, or injustice. Suffering arises when the mind adds subjective interpretations to the event, transforming it into an emotional problem. When we mentally say, "This is terrible, this should not have happened," or "I can't handle this," we stop describing reality and start judging reality. These judgments are not inevitable. They are learned responses, conditioned by expectations, beliefs, and desires. For Stoicism, this is precisely where the mind becomes vulnerable. By accepting these opinions as truths, the individual hands over emotional stability to something external. The Stoic understands that the external event is simply what it is, a datum of reality. It is neither good nor bad in itself. Good and evil, according to this philosophy, reside exclusively in how we choose to think and act in response to the event. When we label a situation as unbearable or unjust, we create an internal narrative that intensifies suffering and limits our ability to act with clarity. Thus, negative thoughts are not absolute truths, but flawed mental constructions, originating from hasty or irrational judgments. They seem convincing because they arise automatically, but they do not withstand rational analysis. By examining these thoughts carefully, the Stoic realizes that many of them are exaggerations, generalizations, or unfounded predictions about the future. Stoic practice therefore consists in undoing this confusion between fact and opinion. By separating what actually happened from the interpretation the mind created, the individual regains control over inner life. The fact remains the same, but suffering diminishes or disappears because it is no longer fueled by distorted judgments. Over time, this exercise strengthens the mind in a consistent and progressive way. The continuous practice of observing, examining, and correcting one's own judgments develops a mental posture that is firmer and less susceptible to immediate emotional impulses. The person begins to react with less intensity, not through repression, but through rational clarity. Gradually, impulsive reactions give way to more conscious and deliberate responses. Situations that once provoked anxiety, irritation, or discouragement are faced with greater balance because the mind no longer automatically accepts distorted interpretations. The individual learns to recognize that the first thought is not necessarily the truest or the most useful. This maturation leads to a central Stoic insight. It is not the world that must change for inner peace to exist, but the way it is interpreted and judged. By abandoning the expectation of controlling the external world, the person regains mastery over inner life, where true stability is possible. Thus, peace ceases to depend on circumstances and comes to rest on the quality of judgments. The trained mind becomes more resilient, less reactive, and more coherent, capable of moving through challenges without being dominated by them. The primary Stoic mechanism of mental protection is the dichotomy of control, a core concept of this philosophy. It establishes a clear separation between what depends on us and what does not. This distinction is not merely theoretical, it is a practical tool for preserving emotional stability and avoiding unnecessary mental exhaustion. Under our control are everything that belongs to the internal domain: thoughts, values, judgments, choices, and attitudes. It is in this sphere that true human freedom resides. Outside our control are the actions of others, the results of our efforts, the past, chance, and external circumstances. Attempting to govern these elements is an inevitable source of frustration because they do not respond to our will. Whenever a negative thought arises, the Stoic confronts it directly with this division. The question is, does this depend on me? If the thought is tied to something outside one's control, such as others' opinions, a mistake already made, or a result that did not occur as expected, persisting in it is considered irrational. Not out of insensitivity, but out of logical clarity. Worrying about the uncontrollable produces no effective action and improves nothing. By recognizing this limitation of control, the mind interrupts the cycle of rumination. Anxiety diminishes because the future is no longer seen as something that must be dominated. Guilt weakens because the past is understood as immutable. Anger loses strength because the actions of others are no longer interpreted as something we should be able to control. On the other hand, when a negative thought concerns something that is under our control, the Stoic does not engage in destructive self-criticism. Mental energy is directed toward rational action, correcting, learning, adjusting conduct. Thus, the dichotomy of control does not promote passivity, but discernment, knowing when to act and when to accept. With continuous practice of this principle, the mind becomes more disciplined and resilient. the individual invests attention only in what can truly be governed, building a firm, calm inner posture that is less susceptible to the fluctuations of the external world. Stoicism teaches that the first mental impulse is not entirely under our control. Negative thoughts often arise automatically as reflexes conditioned by past experiences, emotional habits, and expectations. However, the central point of Stoic practice is recognizing that adhering to these thoughts is a choice. Suffering does not arise from the initial thought, but from uncritical acceptance of it. For this reason, the fundamental Stoic exercise consists in interrupting the immediate impulse and creating a conscious space between stimulus and reaction. This interval, however brief, is decisive because it is where reason can act before emotion takes control. Without this space, the individual reacts automatically, guided by mental habits and emotional conditioning, repeating patterns that generate suffering. By deliberately creating this pause, the Stoic stops immediately identifying with the thought that arises. Instead of reacting, the Stoic observes the mental content with distance, recognizing it as merely an initial impression, not an established fact. This act of observation already weakens the emotional impact of the thought because it breaks the fusion between mind and reaction. Next, the thought is subjected to rational examination. The Stoic analyzes whether the impression corresponds to reality, whether it is useful, and whether it leads to virtuous action. This process transforms the relationship with thoughts. They cease to be automatic commands and become hypotheses that can be accepted or rejected. With constant practice of this exercise, the mind becomes less reactive and more deliberate. The individual responds to events with greater clarity and self-control, significantly reducing the influence of negative impulses. Thus, the space between stimulus and reaction becomes one of the main instruments of mental shielding in Stoicism. The first question is this a fact or a judgment? Many negative thoughts present themselves as descriptions of reality, when in fact they are emotionally charged evaluations. By identifying this difference, the individual stops treating opinions as truths. The second question is this thought useful or merely disturbing? Even if something is unpleasant, mentally insisting on it may produce no constructive action. If the thought only generates anguish, fear, or paralysis, it loses its legitimacy from a Stoic point of view. The third question is, does this thought contribute to acting with virtue? Stoicism measures the value of a thought not by the comfort it brings, but by its capacity to guide rational, just, and balanced action. If the thought does not lead to wisdom, courage, justice, or temperance, it does not deserve to be sustained. When a thought is subjected to reason, its emotional charge weakens. It stops dominating the mind and becomes merely a transient mental content. With consistent practice of this exercise, the individual develops greater self-control, clarity, and emotional stability, becoming less reactive and more deliberate in the face of adversity. For the Stoic, true good does not lie in external results, but in virtue, that is, acting in accordance with reason, expressed through wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. These values constitute the only legitimate criterion of a good life, because they depend exclusively on the individual's will and character, not on circumstances. Negative thoughts arise largely from obsession with outcomes. The mind fixates on the need for success, the search for approval, external recognition, or the constant fear of failure. These goals, although socially valued, lie outside the individual's direct control, as they depend on external factors, unpredictable circumstances, and the will of others. When personal worth is measured by these uncertain outcomes, the mind enters a permanent state of tension and emotional vigilance. Every action becomes accompanied by anxiety, expectation, and fear, because tranquility is conditioned on something that cannot be guaranteed. Success brings momentary relief, failure brings frustration and self-devaluation. This cycle creates instability as inner peace becomes hostage to external variables. For the Stoic, this error of focus represents the primary source of emotional instability. When the criterion of value shifts from what is internal, character, choices and judgments, to what is external, results, approval and circumstances, the individual relinquishes control over inner life, often without realizing it. In this state, the mind ceases to be guided by reason and begins to function reactively. Emotional balance becomes dependent on unpredictable factors, causing the inner state to oscillate according to outcomes. A favorable result produces temporary relief. An unfavorable result produces frustration, fear, or self-reproach. Stability ceases to be an internal trait and becomes circumstantial. This dependence on the external makes the individual particularly vulnerable to anxiety because the future cannot be guaranteed, to comparison because personal worth is measured against others, and to insecurity because any change in circumstances threatens emotional balance. For Stoicism, this condition is equivalent to living in a constant loss of inner autonomy. Correcting this deviation requires returning focus to what truly depends on one's will. By recentralizing value on reason and virtue, the mind regains stability because it rests on foundations that are not subject to the fluctuations of the external world. Stoicism therefore proposes a clear correction, replacing concern with outcomes with attention to the quality of action. When focus returns to what depends on one's own will, acting with virtue, coherence and integrity, results lose the power to define emotional state. Thus the mind stabilizes, no longer seeking validation in uncertainty, and instead grounding itself in what lies within its domain. By shifting attention from outcomes to the quality of action, the mind reorganizes itself. The question ceases to be, will I get what I want? And becomes, am I acting in the best possible way? When conduct is guided by virtue, the outcome loses its power to define emotional state. Success ceases to be a condition for tranquility, and failure ceases to be a threat to personal dignity. This change in perspective stabilizes the mind because it drastically reduces dependence on the external. Even in the face of adverse results, the Stoic recognizes having fulfilled rational duty. In this way, negative thoughts related to insecurity, frustration, or fear lose relevance because they do not interfere with what truly matters, the integrity of character. Thus, focus on virtue functions as an internal axis of stability. When individuals orient their thoughts and actions by this principle, the mind becomes firmer, less reactive, and less susceptible to the fluctuations imposed by chance or by others' expectations. Shielding the mind from a Stoic standpoint does not mean passive resignation or conformism in the face of reality. On the contrary, it means rationally accepting what cannot be changed and directing all mental and practical energy toward acting with excellence in what lies within reach. This distinction is essential to avoid both apathy and unproductive revolt. Emotional resistance to the inevitable is seen by the Stoics as a waste of mental energy. When an individual insists on internally fighting immutable facts, the past, death, human imperfection, or others' behavior, suffering is prolonged without producing any real effect. This resistance does not alter events, it only intensifies inner disturbance. Stoic acceptance is not emotional, but rational. It arises from a clear recognition of the limits of human control. By abandoning the illusion that everything should conform to personal desires, the mind frees itself from continuous frustration. The event remains the same, but the emotional charge associated with it dissolves because there is no longer an unrealistic expectation being frustrated. This process weakens negative thoughts by removing their main foundation, the belief that something should not be the way it is. Or, when this belief is replaced by a lucid understanding of reality, the thought loses its disturbing force. The individual stops wasting mental energy on lamentation and begins to use it constructively. Thus, Stoic acceptance functions as a mechanism of mental shielding. By recognizing the uncontrollable and acting firmly on what is controllable, the mind becomes calmer, more efficient, and more resilient, capable of facing adversity without being dominated by it. Stoicism does not promise a mind permanently free of negative thoughts, because it recognizes them as part of the human experience. What this philosophy offers is something more solid and realistic, a mind trained not to be enslaved by them. Disturbing thoughts will continue to arise, but they will not automatically command emotions or decisions. This inner mastery requires daily practice. The Stoics advocate constant self-examination, in which a person revisits thoughts and reactions, identifying where judgments were poorly formed. Conscious reflection allows recognition of dysfunctional mental patterns, while deliberate correction of judgments adjusts how reality is interpreted. It is a continuous training of reason, not a one-time effort. Over time, this process produces a deep and lasting transformation. The mind becomes more resilient as it no longer reacts disproportionately to adversity. Difficult situations continue to occur, but they no longer produce the same emotional impact because they are faced with greater lucidity and self-control. At the same time, the mind becomes clearer, developing the ability to precisely distinguish facts from opinions. The individual learns to recognize when facing an objective datum of reality and when merely reproducing subjective interpretations, assumptions, or mental exaggerations. This clarity reduces inner confusion and prevents distorted thoughts from gaining authority. In addition, the mind becomes more stable, as it no longer depends on external circumstances to maintain emotional balance. Tranquility is no longer conditioned on favorable outcomes, external approval, or the absence of difficulties. It comes to rest on internal criteria, guided by reason and virtue. Problems continue to exist, but they no longer command the inner state. External difficulties, losses, setbacks, and uncertainties remain part of life, yet they cease to dictate emotional equilibrium. Instead of being experienced as overwhelming forces, problems are understood as situations to be addressed with reason and composure, each requiring an appropriate response rather than an emotional collapse. When challenges are no longer interpreted as threats to identity or self-worth, the mind becomes significantly more stable. The individual does not define personal value by circumstances, failures, or outcomes, but by the quality of judgment and action brought to each situation. As a result, adversity is no longer perceived as a personal attack or a sign of inadequacy, but as a natural and expected aspect of human existence. This shift fundamentally alters the relationship with difficulty. Rather than resisting reality or becoming absorbed in fear and frustration, the individual engages with problems pragmatically. Emotional energy is conserved and redirected toward constructive action, reflection, or acceptance, depending on what the situation requires. The mind remains anchored in what can be governed rather than scattered by what cannot. In this way, inner freedom is preserved even amid life's inevitable fluctuations. Success and failure, gain and loss, praise and criticism lose their power to destabilize the inner life. The individual remains inwardly autonomous, capable of facing uncertainty with steadiness and dignity. This autonomy does not remove hardship, but it ensures that hardship no longer rules the inner world, allowing life to be lived with greater balance, resilience, and clarity. In summary, shielding the mind according to Stoicism means replacing impulsive emotional reactions with rational discernment. It is learning to treat negative thoughts as transient mental occurrences, not as absolute truths that govern life. In doing so, the individual preserves inner freedom and conducts life with greater serenity and awareness.